Consider supporting Archaeo-Soup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you. Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, actually, no, I suppose good afternoon, Andrew. Good afternoon, good morning. It's afternoon for me. It's morning for you. Hello.
How about we just say good day? And
Good day. Good day.
Both parts of the day.
Okay, yeah, we're sharing the same sunshine, the same source of light at least.
That's right.
Now, I have invited you for a chat today because I have very much been enjoying a little computer game that you worked on, and a very specific aspect of that computer game that you worked on. And specifically, this is Far Cry Primal.
Yes.
And the languages within that game, a prehistoric game, a game set tentatively around 12,000 BC, although archaeologically there are things to query within the game. But today, I really want to try and get into the weeds, if possible, on how you did what you did with that computer game. So first of all, can you just introduce yourself and your role in the institution where you currently are?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Andrew Byrd. I'm an associate professor of linguistics at the University of Kentucky. And I am an Indo-Europeanist. And what that means is that I study a lot of ancient languages like Latin and Greek and Sanskrit. And our goal is to kind of figure out the source language that all of those languages comes from.
I sort of already asked you this off camera, but is that inference a form of philology or not?
Yeah, so when we talk about philology, it's really like if you ask someone who's a philologist, they're interested in the history and the structure of the language and the textual analysis and the whole shebang. And as an Indo-Europeanist, you have to, right? So you can't really study a language if you're not looking at the texts that were written in that language. Where are these texts coming from? How many copies of those texts have been done? Things like that. But also the genres of the text, right? So the language that you find within, say, poetry, within Latin is very different from the inscriptional language for Latin. And you have to keep all of those things in mind.
Okay. And so, I suppose that leads me to my first question then, in terms of constructing language or languages for this game. So my understanding is that you and 4 other people at least are named, and I went out of my way to pick up the easy Wenja Phrasebook. In the construction of Wenja, which is a language of the protagonist, Udam, which is the language of the antagonists, and also Izilla, which is a language that I'm yet to come across, but I'm pretty sure I know the group that
you haven't come across?
I haven't yet, but I have a friend who has, and I think they've described elements. I think basically they're in the Neolithic, funnily enough, even though we're in the late Paleolithic in the game. But I suppose my first question, with that in mind, with these languages in mind, is because there are no written sources, and you are creating these hypothetical languages.
Yes.
Is it more of an abstract exercise, in so much as the difference between formal and informal Latin, or for example written and spoken or dialects of Greek, for example, are well understood, and you can compare texts and do analyses as to what survives and what doesn't. But how do you actually get into the mindset of creating a language for which there is no direct evidence? I nearly said no evidence at all then, but no direct evidence.
There's no direct evidence that we know of, right? Maybe in 50 years someone will unearth a treasure trove of stone tablets that are written in. Who knows? But as of right now, there is no direct evidence of this language. It's all indirect, but the amount of indirect evidence is just overwhelming, right?
Okay.
So all of the languages that have been written down that are still spoken today, continue these little traces of words and of grammar and of word order that are inherited from this language that was spoken about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So. Go ahead.
Well, that's what I was going to say. And you say this language. Do you think it was that there were fewer languages in the past or in prehistory?
Who knows? I mean,
Okay.
there were fewer people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's likely that those people lived in smaller groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that those groups each spoke their own language variety. I mean, what is a language, right? Is there such a thing as language? Is there such a thing as English? The way that you speak
Yeah.
is similar but different from the way that I speak, right? Are
Uh-huh.
we both
Uh-huh.
speaking English? I mean, so these are all huge questions, and whether or not there was one Proto-Indo-European, we can argue about that for centuries, right? Because a lot of it depends on like what is your notion of language.
Yes.
But the idea is that there were this group of people who spoke a variety of language. We'll just put that in quotes.
Uh-huh.
That was mutually intelligible, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that these people spoke varieties of a language that were related to each other,
Okay.
in that they go back to some earlier source.
Yeah. Well, and actually, it's funny because when you touch on that in terms of the difference between English, and I suppose actually I should say British English, in so much as obviously there's variants and dialects across and within each of the countries of the United Kingdom,
Sure.
and broadly comparing that to what might call versions of American English. Obviously, again, there are similar variations. I can't help but think that a reason for that difference that I can understand today as a modern English speaker is identity. So,
Oh, sure.
often we will reinforce, for example, spellings or pronunciations of words like aluminum or aluminium,
That's right.
because of strongly held beliefs as to how something should be said, because that's just how it's done. And is this a way that you get into the mindset of creating different groups speaking similar, related, but ultimately different dialects or languages?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly it's impossible,
Right.
right? So we don't know what their identities were.
No.
We don't know how they viewed the world per se. I mean, we have bits and pieces of like this is the proper way that you treat a guest,
Yeah.
right? So if in Indo-European culture, if someone arrives at your doorstep and you don't treat them as as a guest, and that you give them food and clothes and things like that, then there are severe consequences for
Yeah.
that.
Hmm.
But there are other things that we simply have no idea how they thought.
No.
So there are a lot of question marks, right? So I think anybody who tells you that this is the way that the Indo-Europeans spoke, or this is the way that they thought, is kidding themselves, because
Yeah.
the evidence is so fragmented, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we can't say with some degree of certainty that we're fairly certain that the word for father began with a P, right? Or
Yeah.
we're
Hmm.
fairly certain that the word for mother began with an M, or the word for me began with an M, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these are things that we're fairly certain about, because there's so many similarities among languages like English and Russian and Hindi, right?
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
it just coincidence is ruled out.
So, is it P's and B's for father? So, Pater, Baba, this kind of thing.
Well, Baba is probably some sort of onomatopoeia. And actually, I'm not onomatopoeia, but child language. There are a handful of sounds that babies first start
Hmm.
speaking.
Hmm.
Actually, so my youngest son, he just turned 2 in April, and when he was 9 months old, or no, 6 months old, on Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
he just immediately started doing ba 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 da 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 ga 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 ga, and all my relatives at Thanksgiving were like, "Oh my gosh, he just called you da da," and I'm like, "No, he's just
No. No.
babbling." And so when
Yep.
babies have access to this limited set of syllables, right, then
Uh-huh.
the first words that they create, words for their caretakers, mothers, grandmothers, things like that, they tend to look like baba, dada,
Yeah. Yeah.
nana,
Yeah.
mama, things like that, right?
Yeah.
But the P in father in Proto-Indo-European, now that actually we think was an agent noun. So one who X's, one who, like a writer is an agent noun,
Right. Yes.
right? So we think it was an agent noun of to protect.
Okay.
So the root to protect was pach, and so pachter was the protector. So it kind
Nice.
of gives you kind of a window into this formal language for father, which we still have in English, by the way, right? I
Uh-huh.
don't go up to my dad and say, "Hello, father."
No.
I say,
Yeah.
"Hi, dad." But in a formal setting, I'll say, "Oh, yes, my father, he does this, da 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 da."
Yeah. Yeah. Or someone
So
will say, "What? Yeah. Who is your father?" as opposed to "Who's your dad?" Yeah. This kind of thing. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Interesting. Interesting. No, it must be a fascinating experiment to be having such a small child and watching them learn to speak and this kind of thing.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's absolutely wonderful. It's also really interesting to see. You were talking about identity. It's really interesting to see which features my sons pick up, right? So they identify more with me as the father, as the dad, versus my wife, the mother. And I could see this in very subtle things. So, for example, the thing that's on top of a house, the ROOF.
Yeah.
How would you say that word?
Roof.
See, I would say roof.
Oh.
And
okay.
so I find that I don't know. OOs tend to be pronounced in different ways in different dialects. So some people say room, some say room. But I've found that my sons say roof more than roof because they're identifying with me, right? Or the consonant sequence STR, as in STREET. How would you say that? The thing that you drive down.
Street.
See, you say it with an S, and if you listen to how I say it with an SH, street. And I find that my sons actually, they have that pronunciation versus the other.
Street.
Isn't that a beautiful?
As soon as I go down that road, I start being Sean Connery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, help me. Shush. So, coming back then to this idea of constructing these languages, one thing that I remember picking up from anthropology and linguistics when I sort of did a module at uni was probably I understand a fairly outdated but nonetheless useful concept of a structural understanding of language, and in particular I think it was Levi-Strauss who was one of the people who definitely bled into my brain, and this idea of culture being language and language being culture. Sure. And so and by that saying, and just to explain for people at home, saying that culture can change in the same way that language changes, but also another way of exploring that is to say that to understand people, you should try to understand their languages. It's one of the key tenets of modern anthropology in terms of writing ethnographies and this kind of thing. And when I look at the three key language groups that were created, the Wenja are described as the word means hunters, Udam means conquerors, and Izila means the masters. And are you therefore subscribing to a structural linguistic paradigm by essentially having them named after how they behave and what they do? Presumably these are meant to be projections of themselves in terms of their tribal characters.
So yes. So one secret about conlangers, like myself. So a conlang is a constructed language. It's a made-up language, and those three languages for the game are conlangs. They're not specifically Proto-Indo-European. No. But very often when you're asked to do a task, right? So someone comes up to you and say, "Hey, I'm writing this book, or I'm making this game. Can you make up the language for me?" They'll already have certain words made up, right? So when we were asked to do this job, Wenja, Udam, Izila, Batari, Takar, things like that, all of those words were actually given to us. And so we looked at them and we said, okay, this is how you're wanting the structure of this language to be, and this is how you're wanting this structure to be, right? And so we kind of back-formed the language from that. So in Wenja, we already had the word wan, which means to hunt, wana. And so I took that, I modified it slightly using some fancy Indo-European stuff, and you can get a winja, meaning the hunters. Right. Udam, dam, is actually the root, which means to conquer. It's actually in our word dominate. Okay. Dominus in Latin. And that's actually an imperative form, conquer. And then Izila, I had to do a lot of fancy footwork here, but it actually is related to Latin eros, the word for master. And but you have to pronounce it in Izila, not as Izila, but as Hisilach.
Oh, wow.
So if you listen to Batari, and I really highly recommend that you watch the first scene where Batari, the queen of the Izila, meets Takar, you'll actually hear her say Hisilach. And it gets into this kind of like, and it sounds kind of like a snake when she talks. But yes, we absolutely were playing this up, right? We were playing up the fact that these are people who are trying to enslave the Wenja and the Udam. The Udam, all they care about, their mentality was just dominate, was just kill. And actually we have two different words to protect within Wenja and Udam, and they basically speak the same language. In Oh, it's been so long. Oh, I can't believe I forgot the roots. But in one, oh, okay, I got it. So in Wenja, shlaka means to like defend yourself, but to actively fight
Hmm.
in order to defend. But in in Udam, they have a root which I forget, which just basically means you're defending yourself by actively just
Uh-huh.
proactively killing,
Okay.
right?
Uh-huh.
And so
Uh-huh.
these cultural worldviews were encoded into the roots.
Okay,
Uh,
that's interesting. So, I mean, you've touched a little bit on it, I guess, towards the end of that answer there. But so my lovely wife in a former life before she does what she does now, she was actually a interested in reconstructing languages
cool.
at Oxford, and she often describes the difference between, for example, Greek and Latin as being, and obviously this is a very broad characterization, but in Latin you get a sense of structure and form and a sort of a certain what's the word, utilitarian relationship with language, and in her characterization at least, in Greek you have extra things thrown in as flowery bits that don't necessarily perform a function for meaning, but are useful for adding to the feel of what you're saying, and also, for example, especially in more poetic use. Now,
Yeah, I
that
don't know. I mean, so I think what she's referring to are what are called particles,
uh huh.
which are these kind of words that you can't assign to a particular word class, right? So
Hmm.
nouns, verbs, things like that. And certainly Greek has a ton of those.
Yep. Yep.
But Latin has them too. But maybe doesn't have quite as many. The thing that makes Greek very different from Latin is that Latin, you basically you have the language as is spoken in Rome,
Hmm.
and you have varieties that are slightly related to that. But that's essentially Latin. But
Hmm.
Greek is like there are 50 dialects of
Hmm.
Greek,
Hmm.
right? And so it feels a lot more organic and chaotic.
And
Uh,
well, and I suppose she'll probably slightly murder me for giving such a simple characterization of her characterization, but with that sort of that notion in mind, I suppose. Um, would you say that any of that was actually deliberately built into these languages? So aside from say characteristics and structure and this kind of thing, is there anything about their attitudes beyond? So you mentioned things like the word to protect and the relationship between say the different variants, because my understanding from the book is that Udam is a sort of simplified version of Wenja. Um,
yeah.
is there something that comes out of that in terms of the character that you want to convey through the languages? And for example, I find myself as I'm playing the game hearing words coming from the Wenja that are very familiar. I'll sort of find myself going. Actually, they didn't say that in English, or indeed in my case in Welsh. But there'll be little things that I'll go, oh, that sounds like what they're saying, and I understand where they're coming from, and this is without too much exposure. So we're trying to make Wenja more familiar and
Yes.
convey a character in that sense.
Yes. So it was our goal because, part of this as a linguist, as a professor, it wasn't just to work on a video game, which was super awesome, by the
Hmm.
way, but
Hmm.
it was also so that the gamer like yourself could be playing and be like, wait, I just saw the translation in the water and they said wadar.
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
sounds like
yeah.
water,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And why, how, right? And
Hmm.
then that gets them, wondering what's going on here, and then they discover Proto-Indo-European. So yes, a lot of those choices were intentional to make it more familiar for, uh, especially an English-speaking gamer, so that
Yeah.
they would recognize those words. Yeah,
Interesting. And so, in that sense, very much a gateway drug to Indo-European studies, then.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
the goal. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the game has been out for I guess 3.5 years now.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I still get emails about it. I still get people writing me in Proto-Indo-European and
Oh,
Wenja.
really? Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
wow.
yeah.
That's brilliant.
So,
I,
so
I,
it's done something.
excellent. I haven't quite gone that far down the rabbit hole yet, but give me time. I may well. Um, so there was one word that stands out to me as curious, and I talked about this with my lovely wife just to make sure that I wasn't imagining that this was a curious thing, and that is the word for mammoth,
Oh yeah, yeah,
mammoth.
yeah,
Now,
yeah.
now, given that there's no continuity between what that word might have been and what it is today to describe a creature that we discovered in the, I don't know, the 1800s or something, or rediscovered rather. How did you decide to use that? Because that seems to be such a direct connection, and
Sure.
and potentially, I'm trying not to use language that may well sound bad, but I suppose almost linguistically sort of patronising, as it were, sort of saying, "Oh, it wasn't that different to what we speak today." I mean, and yet it makes such a simple connection. And was that the intent, or was it, or were you aware of some problems in terms of introducing essentially modern words into prehistoric languages?
We were encouraged by Ubisoft to use as many modern words as possible.
Okay.
As long as it was, as long as these words were they felt authentic, they felt like they were part of a system, right? They didn't feel like they were clearly English words that had been taken into this language.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, the game is set 7,000 years before Proto-Indo-European was spoke.
Yeah.
So we don't have a word for mammoth.
No. No.
There's no way to reconstruct it. Now, sometimes what we would do is we would make compounds, right? So, for example, the word for yak, there is no word for yak within Proto-Indo-European.
Mm-hmm.
To our knowledge, they didn't know about yaks, but we had to invent a word. And if you had to invent a word for yak, what would you do?
I'd probably start where they started, in so much as and this is the conclusion I essentially came to with the mammoth, is that we describe mammoth as mammoth because of the size. So the name comes through other associations within the language. Hence, we assign that word to mammoth. And I guess there must be a reason for yak that's quite similar, I guess.
Well, so for us, for the compound, so basically we said, what is a yak? It's a cow with lots of hair on it. So we call it a hairy cow. And the word for hairy or dense or thick in Indo-European is actually the word dense in English. That comes from Latin. So dansu was the word for hairy, and cow was gao or gawi. And so the word for yak is dangao. Now, that's one thing we could have done with mammoth. We could have created some sort of compound.
Like
but
hairy
with
elephant or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But with these very, very frequent words, bear, wolf, mammoth, that you hear throughout the entire game, they wanted them to be short and recognizable, so that the player, when they see a mammoth coming, charging across the screen, they don't want that word to be 6 syllables long. They want it to be 1 or 2, right? Yeah. And they also want the player to very quickly memorize that word so that they know what's coming their way.
And that makes sense, yeah.
So you're absolutely right that, mammoth, I mean, that's directly mammoth. That's absolutely what it was. But, we did it intentionally because we don't want to make a system that's hard. We want to make a system that's easy and something that they can pick up organically.
Yeah. So you don't want to have a compound word that's like the hairy, tree-crushing, massive beast. And this,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
because by the third syllable, you have already been crushed.
Killed by it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and actually, this is where I guess we come back to this idea of the purpose and function of language. And again, it's maybe subtly moving away possibly from a structural understanding. But I have heard people say that things in modern script, things like spelling mistakes don't matter quite so much, so long as the meaning behind the word is being conveyed. And is that I suppose in a broader sense where you sort of come down on this idea of constructing languages? It's about conveying meaning and having in mutually intelligible meaning, as opposed to something which is very cerebral and intellectually pleasing, if you know what I mean. I'm sure you could probably go down.
So what do you mean by cerebral?
I mean in so much as the way that you could make very abstract connections between concepts and sounds and words and create something that goes through essentially a little maze of decisions to get to a language, as opposed to having something which conveys a meaning with a certain sense of immediacy. So as you say, choosing mammoth as opposed to going through this sort of little logical maze that you may well find intellectually or cerebrally pleasing.
Right.
I mean that in so much as intellectual as opposed to neuroscience, as it were.
Right. I mean, there were some things that were, intellectually pleasing, or just we did because we thought it was funny, because most of the language in the game, especially that of Azila, you never see translated.
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff in the game that I'm the only person who ever knew what it meant.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was, so we have some in jokes in there. So on one of what are called barks. So barks are lines of dialogue that aren't part of the main narrative, but are, you meet someone in the world, and let's say they're being attacked by a boar, or they're making lunch or whatever. We'll be saying these words. So if you sneak up behind a group of Wenja, so they don't know you're there, and you're just listening to their conversation. Again, none of this is translated. One of the people will be like, I'm hungry. Okay, so you translate, I'm hungry. Here, have some, mammoth. Okay, eat some mammoth. Ooh, that mammoth was tasty. And there is no word for tasty within Proto-Indo-European, so coming from Kentucky, what did we decide to do? So we decided to make it into finger-licking good.
I knew it, yep. Go on.
So if you sneak up behind someone, you may hear Pali Klaijan Su for tasty. So, there are things like that. But Ubisoft, they really, what they did in taking this risk, it was a huge, huge risk, the game, in multiple ways. I mean, in making a first-person shooter without guns, right? That got a lot of flack, and I think a lot of people who gave that flack and then played it, they were like, actually, this is a really good game. But using something that nobody speaks as the main language, that's a huge risk. So they wanted to kind of eliminate risky points when possible, right? So some of the pronunciations, especially within Azila, there are a lot of ch sounds and r sounds within Azila, and we actually had to come to a deal with Ubisoft, like, to eliminate certain ch sounds because they thought the actors would find these words too hard to pronounce, right?
Okay, yeah.
So anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but the use of mammoth was, for them, it was a good thing because it made the player feel more included within the game versus less so.
Okay. So, just a couple more things then, just before I let you go, because I know you have a phone call or meeting coming up. First of all, would you, if you could, want to meet people from that time and attempt to communicate with them? Now, the reason I ask that question is I'm often asked this question about just time travel in general, and my response is always essentially not without inoculations and guaranteed return, and maybe something for the smell. What's your thinking in terms of attempting to reach out and talk to people who are speaking a language that you've never, or that no one has ever heard before?
So I know this is going to sound kind of weird, but I lean more towards no than yes, because part of the magic of reconstructing languages is not knowing. Right? Yeah. Is like, if you have all of the facts, then a lot of the mystery of the language disappears, right? And I think a lot of the most interesting work that's been done in my field has been, okay, we don't know this specific thing, but I'm going to use some sort of ingenious idea to discover what that thing is. But yeah, I mean, I'm 5'6", not terribly athletic, go back in time. I mean, I would probably die within half a day, So
I don't know. Take a bucket of the Colonel's best with you. You'll be fine. Finger licking good. Offer it up to them. Okay, and I suppose my other question would be, I say recently, a few years ago now, there was an interesting bit of research done that talked about hyper-conserved words from about 15,000, they reckon, maybe years ago, and I think it was 23 words or so that are similar enough in various languages that we can infer. I think one of them was words like worm, ash, I think was one, black was another, things like this. Do you put much stock in that type of assertion, given what we just talked about in terms of, as you say, part of the magic is not fully knowing? Do you think that the idea of trying to make concrete connections between modern language and and prehistoric, gone languages, languages which are no longer present, is a useful attempt, or a useful thing to be attempting, as it were.
I mean, that's what I do. I wouldn't say I go back 15,000 years. No. I mean, I would if I could. I mean, the idea that you can reconstruct a language for not 7,000 years ago, but 15,000 years ago, it is in theory possible. But the problem is that as languages evolve through time, more and more noise is introduced into the system. So if we tried to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European based on English, Hindi, Russian, and Italian, the language that we would come up with would be vastly different from the language that we actually know, that's based on Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and Hittite, and things like that, right? Yeah. So is it possible that there are words in English that go back 15,000 years? Sure. I mean, if you look at non-Indo-European languages, the fact that the words for 6 and 7 in Hebrew, I think it's shesh, and it's something like shivun. I mean, it sounds so similar. Or if you look at the personal pronouns within Turkish, the first person singular pronoun in Turkish is an M. What is that, right? And so it's likely that these things are connected, but the problem is the methodologies that we use within our field, so specifically the comparative method and internal reconstruction, they don't work with regularity. They just simply break down, and you can't find regular correspondences. No. So, but as far as like there being hyper-conservative words, I don't know. That a lot of that seems random to me, because languages, of course, they borrow words for new cultural items, right? So new types of food. So, we have the word burrito from Spanish, and we have the word sushi from Japanese. It's clear why we did that. We borrow words for color. That's clear. So our word purple is not Germanic, right? That comes from the Mediterranean. Black itself is not the Indo-European word for black, so I don't know what's that. I mean, we even borrow pronouns. So the pronoun they is from Old Norse. It's from the Vikings, right? So,
Well, and yet you've just sort of strayed a little bit into something that I do know something about, in so much as what's clear, though, in the transition from, say 1,500 years ago to now, is that there are certain words connected with things that you do and use every day, like body and people that you love, or days of the week, this kind of thing, that do stay strangely similar. So, but also at the same time, the rate of change can also be markedly observable. So, for example, the word for leg, in modern English, I think that's an Old Norse, but legger or something like that. Geneka is neck, this kind of thing.
Right, that is true.
And but also, things like beard and hand are relatively unchanged. And so do you think that's where the noise comes from? It's these decisions that aren't. It's not groupthink, logical, cost-benefit ratio decisions that are made about what and how to change a language. It's more just a case of it comes through usage, and therefore these direct connections with prehistory are bound to be problematic, if not, as you say, a bit magical.
I think that it's certainly true what you just said. What you just said is true, that they are connected to usage, right? And that the trajectory of a language is intimately connected to its history, to who invades that particular culture, things like that. Like if you look at, say, the German language and you compare that to English, German is so much more conservative in terms of sticking to its older Proto-Germanic roots than English is. But there's a good reason for that, right? They weren't invaded by the Vikings. They weren't invaded by the the French-speaking Normans, right? And those events, they severely impacted how our language works. But as for like there being 23 words, I don't know. I mean, it is certainly true that words that you use all the time are more likely to be archaic. So, for example, the verb to be in English is an incredibly archaic verb. So be goes back to Proto-Indo-European, the word to become. He is from Hesti within Proto-Indo-European. It's Latin est, as in I-E, id est, right? Am is from Hesmi within Proto-Indo-European. Was and were, those used to mean to spend the night within Proto-Indo-European. I mean, these are really, really archaic things that are fossilized within our language. And the only reason we tolerate them is because we say am, is, was, were, all the time, right? So certainly usage leads to these more archaic features, but that doesn't guarantee them to stay in the language, right? Because all sorts of changes can happen, both cultural changes, but also, linguistic changes. There are certain linguistic processes that lead to the replacement of certain words for whatever.
Well, and therefore, just to slightly extend on that, then. So, for example, with Norman invasion came, obviously, in addition to ways to describe things, little, large, big, small. We don't need all of that, but it's in our language. But also things like beef to describe the food and cow to describe the animal. Definitely reflects in.
Isn't that wonderful?
And it's wonderful. But also, I suppose again it comes down to I'm wondering if it comes down to. I suspect it comes down to. Is it words that are more, as it were, politically sensitive are more likely to change. So really, an invader doesn't care what you call your wife. An invader doesn't care what you call your hand, but they do care about what it is that you're serving up to them on a plate. This kind of thing.
Probably, but I think that's very culturally specific, right? So that these English-speaking commoners are taking care of the cows, they're taking care of the sheep, they're taking care of the chicken, and then they feed beef and mutton and poultry, right? So I think the reason we have those words is because when those commoners were speaking with their masters, so to speak, they had to speak French, and so they learned within that specific situation, i.e. when you're making cow into a food, that it is now beef, because they say boeuf, right?
But also I can imagine that I can imagine some house proud Saxon lady going, well, in my house we eat beef, kind of, because it comes down the social ladder as well.
That's right, because
to reach up to that word.
Exactly, they're trying to improve their status. They know that to get anywhere in this world, you speak French. And so in this household, we will act like proper people, and we will talk about things within. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And but I won't go on to talk about how that affected the Welsh language in South Wales and the coal industry and the dastardly English. But again, it happens everywhere, and I think it was interesting just to see some of that, just bringing it back to the whole reason that I'm talking to you, to see some of that reflected in these structures and in the game. I suppose finally, is there anything that you would like people to be aware of or to take away from their experience while hearing these languages? I mean, I could frankly come up with questions for you all day, but I'm going to end on this. Is there anything that you would want someone to really reflect on or to notice while they're playing? Yeah,
I mean, I think our goal for the game wasn't just to get Indo-European into a video game and show 4 million people, 5 million people this ancient language. It was really to show that prehistoric people were not dumb, and that was one of the big goals of the game. And I think personally, Far Cry Primal, obviously I'm very biased, but is the best prehistoric game out there, because most prehistoric games they're like the cavemen, they're dumb, they're simple, they can't think, things like that, right?
Well, also, frankly, they are cavemen, they live in caves, whereas actually in this game they're living in huts.
Exactly.
Precisely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for us, our goal was to create a system, and it is a fully fledged language, right? It is, despite sometimes you'll see translations that are a bit broken. That's not actually what the language is, right? It's got agreement markers. It's got a very complex system of what are called clitics to show who's doing what within the sentence. It's got gender, different gender systems within Wenja and Azila. So in Wenja, and this reflects their worldview. So going back to what you said earlier, I think you'll like this. In Wenja, their genders are animate and inanimate. So basically, does the noun that I'm referring to, does it have a spirit? Okay. And so if they're talking about, say, a tree, trees have spirits, but rocks do not. And so that will be reflected within the verbal system. Now,
Yeah.
in Azila, because it is kind of this, our goal is to enslave everybody, it's rational versus irrational. So the Azila will be rational, the gods are rational, and Wenja, if they respect the Wenja, are rational. And in the first scene where Batari is talking to Takart, she initially calls him a he.
Uh-huh.
And then when he says, up yours, I'm not going to join your tribe, she starts calling him an it, which reflects this shift from rational to irrational.
I like it. It also ties in very much with sort of barbarian civilized dichotomies as well, doesn't it? They are them, we are us.
Yeah. And there are languages that do this, right? That have these sorts of gender systems. So that was really our goal, is for someone to walk away going, A, that was fun, but B, that was a really interesting culture. That wasn't something that was cartoonish in any sort of way. And we wanted that to be reflected through the language as well.
I like it. I'm not going to keep on following up. Thank you very much for your time.
Sure, today. It's my pleasure.
It has been a real pleasure. And also, I mean, in that sense, I found you via your website or blog. I'll leave a link below.
Yeah,
and
speakingprimal.com.
Exactly, yes.
And I also want to mention, so my wife, Brenna, who worked on this project with me, she and I are making, right now, we are making a video game called The Anatolian Trail, Roots of the Ancients, where two twins go back in time to the age of the Indo-Europeans, and they go through 12 different zones, each corresponding to an Indo-European branch. And so, hopefully this thing will come to fruition in about 3 or 4 years, but
that's really exciting. Well, in that case, I'll definitely be in touch then.
Cool.
I'll keep an eye out for it. As I say, if anyone wants to comment below or has any extra questions or notions, if I can, I'll definitely pass them on, and maybe perhaps you'll get a direct response in the comments below. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Take care.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.